Story 1. The Smuggler Who Hid Spices in Poetry. You close your eyes and I want you to imagine the scent of cinnamon drifting through a dim harbor at dawn. A ship creaks against the wooden dock, ropes taut with salt and thyme. Men whisper, crates shift, and the ledger books remain spotless, unmarked by the truth. This is where our first story begins, on the edge of trade, poetry, and crime. In the 18th century, as European empires expanded their reach across oceans, spices became more than mere kitchen luxuries. Cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, and cloves were rarer than gold in some regions, driving fortunes, wars, and betrayals. For the merchants who carried these goods, the line between legal commerce and criminal smuggling was razor-thin. Taxes, tariffs, and monopolies dictated profit margins, and for those unwilling to obey the crown or the company, smuggling became the only way forward. One such smuggler, known only through fragments of documents, customs reports, and, curiously, poetry, crafted a method unlike any other. He did not hide his contraband in barrels of flour, nor beneath false ship decks. Instead, he concealed his trade in the flow of words. The merchant poet. The figure at the heart of this story has no surviving portrait. His name appears differently across records, sometimes French, sometimes Dutch, sometimes Portuguese, leading historians to believe he deliberately altered his identity depending on the port. Yet one thread unites the scraps. He wrote verse. Long, lyrical poems that, on the surface, seemed harmless tributes to the sea, to voyages, to distant lands. But buried inside these lines, careful readers would find patterns, references to flowers not native to the described setting, metaphors involving measurements of weight, or rhymes that hinted at cargo counts. For example, a stanza about 10 nightingales caged in cedar might, in reality, indicate 10 barrels of clove hidden beneath a shipment of cloth. Customs officers, often poorly educated in literature, would stamp the documents without suspicion. After all, what harm could a poem hold? A world of restrictions. To understand his daring, you need to know the laws of his time. The Dutch East India Company maintained a near-total monopoly on spice trade from the Indonesian archipelago. Any merchant caught transporting cloves or nutmeg outside official channels faced imprisonment, confiscation, or worse, execution. The Portuguese, though fatting in maritime power, still clung to their old roots. The British Crown taxed imports heavily, ensuring that smugglers could undercut official markets with illicit goods. Ports like Marseille, Lisbon, and Amsterdam became battlegrounds not of armies, but of inspectors and smugglers. Spices were contraband as dangerous as weapons, and poetry became the most unlikely weapon of all. The first discovery. The earliest known record of our merchant poet comes from a seizure in Cadiz, Spain, 1742. Customs officers, tipped off by rival traders, intercepted a ship said to carry unregistered cloves. Upon searching, they found little. No false bottoms, no hidden sacks, only cargo that matched the manifest. Among the papers was a collection of poems, each signed only with a single letter. They were dismissed as harmless. Yet, when the spices later appeared in Naples sold at a profit impossible under legal trade, the suspicion grew. Was the poetry a code? This question spread like wildfire among inspectors. Some began reading every merchant's papers, treating verse as contraband itself. Others dismissed it, unwilling to believe smugglers would risk exposure in something so public. But whispers of the poet smuggler had begun. Voices from the docks. To get closer to the truth, you must hear the dockworkers' accounts. In Marseille, a sailor later testified that his captain always recited poetry when counting cargo. The men thought it eccentric, maybe even mad. But years later, when questioned under oath, the sailor realized the poems mapped directly onto the ship's hold. The rhyme, 3 roses, red as fire, corresponded to 3 hidden crates near the bow. Dockside gossip painted him as a phantom, sometimes a Frenchman with a trimmed beard, other times a Dutchman fluent in trade jargon. Always, though, he carried a leather folio of poems, ink smudged from the sea. His secret weapon wasn't merely his smuggling roots. It was language itself. An unresolved thought. If poetry was his code, then who was meant to read it? Surely not the inspector who received the hidden meaning. And how many shipments passed beneath their noses, disguised as harmless verse? You may be wondering how words something as delicate as a sonnet or a haiku could hold the weight of international crime. But this was no romantic poet lounging in a cafe. This was a man whose ink carried the scent of cinnamon, whose metaphors were freighted with lawless enterprise. In this section, we follow the trail of codes, intercepts, and obsession. The investigator who read too closely. In 1751, a Dutch customs agent named Johann Albrecht de Vries took an unusual interest in maritime paperwork. Unlike most in his station, de Vries had a background in classical languages. He saw not just numbers and goods, but narrative. When a poetic manifest caught his eye titled "The River Sleeps Like a Copper Serpent," he didn't just skim it, he translated it. What he found disturbed him. The poem described a mythical voyage, a captain sailing from the island of glass and fire, likely Bandanera, to the city where the pigeons sing to iron bells, Lisbon. Each stanza ended with a peculiar coupling, one natural, one mechanical. A bell of bronze for every dove, a sprig of spice for every glove. De Vries connected the phrasing with cargo customs. Bronze bells were a common export, gloves a Dutch luxury, both often shipped alongside nutmeg. He theorized that this poem masked a shipment of 24 crates. When cross-checking with port registries, he discovered a vessel matching the poem's course had recently unloaded 24 unregistered barrels marked as preserved fruits in Lisbon. It was his first thread. A pattern of poetry. De Vries began collecting documents from various ports, manifests, diaries, letters, but he focused especially on poetry. Through cooperation with other curious agents in Antwerp and Bordeaux, he assembled 19 poems, all unsigned, all bearing cryptic references to cargo. But one recurring element kept surfacing: the harbor flower. This phrase, appearing in different linguistic forms, was always connected to numbers and directional terms. 2 harbor flowers bloom at stern, beneath the salt where fire can't burn. In another, 4 petals face the rising moon, their roots held fast by cedar's tomb. To a literary scholar, these might be vivid images. To de Vries, they were smuggler's instructions. Petals likely referred to crates, cedar to clove, a spice known for its woody, fragrant qualities, and moon to eastward positioning in the ship's hold. He now believed this was a systematic operation, not one-off poetic flair. Someone had created a cipher language built entirely from layered metaphor, linguistic camouflage. Enter the translator. De Vries wasn't alone in his obsession. Across the sea in Genoa, a merchant-turned-linguist named Luciana Rinaldi had also come across similar verse. She had been commissioned to translate merchant logs into Portuguese, and in doing so, found repeated poetic stanzas embedded between the lines. But where de Vries sought pattern, Rinaldi pursued authorship. Her research uncovered references to a poet known by the moniker El Versero del Mar, the sea versifier. She believed this was the same man behind the coded spice manifests. The versero was whispered about among port taverns, described as a recluse who once served as a Jesuit novice, then turned rogue after witnessing corruption in colonial trade. Rinaldi's notes suggest he may have begun writing poetic trade logs simply to amuse himself, before realizing their power. The more she searched, the more she noticed something chilling. Poems were being reused with slight variations across different ships, years apart. The smuggling network wasn't small, it was vast, and it was coordinated. The cipher book. In 1754, Rinaldi's breakthrough came from an unlikely place: a confiscated sailor's journal seized during a portside raid in Malta. Among sea shanties and crude sketches was a single folded parchment, a cipher key. Unlike a traditional codebook, this wasn't numerical. It was symbolic, visual, a flower with 4 petals, each marked with spice names and quantities. Beneath the flower, poetry couplets like clues. When lilies lean to morning sun, trade barrels 3 before it's done. This was the template behind the coded verses. Each stanza could be built from the petals, depending on location, quantity, and intended recipient. The document matched every poem both De Vries and Rinaldi had studied. They had their Rosetta Stone. The network unveiled. The next step was daunting. With help from authorities in The Hague and Lisbon, De Vries and Rinaldi compiled a cross-continental timeline of spice shipments. Using the cipher, they uncovered over 40 smuggling operations linked by poetic logs between 1740 and 1755. Interestingly, none of the smugglers were ever caught red-handed. The poems were their only commonality, and even then they were only prosecuted for tax evasion or minor misfiling. The Versero remained unnamed, a ghost, an architect with no address. But not all loose ends were tied. In 1756, a poem appeared in a completely different context, a printed chapbook sold in the markets of Naples. Among stories and songs, one poem stood out, The Silk Maker's Dusk. Rinaldi recognized the structure instantly. The stanzas matched the old pattern, but the items now referenced silk, opium, and ivory. The Versero's cipher had evolved. Had the smuggler now turned to other contraband? Had someone else taken up the code? Or was the poet expanding his empire? A lingering question. If the cipher was public, could others have adopted it for their own criminal ends? And if so, how many more crimes, quiet and poetic, have slipped past history unnoticed, hidden beneath metaphors and meter? You followed the verses this far through customs halls and coastal towns, through petals and metaphors, through spice trails disguised as sonnets. Now we reach the final stanza, where the smuggler's tale meets its long shadow. But as you'll see, truth doesn't always arrive with a slam of a gavel or the clang of a prison door. Sometimes it's quieter. Sometimes it ends with a poem left unsigned. A case without a name. By 1757, European trade was shifting rapidly. The 7 Years' War had begun, throwing naval routes into chaos. British and French blockades strained shipping lanes, and with imperial ships preoccupied with wartime patrols, smuggling surged. Amid this backdrop, El Versero del Mar, the elusive sea versifier, seemed to vanish. No new poems matching his style or cipher were documented for over a year. But one final document would surface this time, not in a port, but in a courtroom. In 1759, in Bruges, a legal case was brought against a minor shipping guild accused of tax evasion. During evidence collection, authorities found a letter written in an elegant, flowing script, clearly intended for a merchant in Lisbon. The letter began with what appeared to be a personal poem. Where almond trees bend by moon's decree, I send the bark of distant sea. In silver leaf and whispering clove, I leave behind what none may know. Unlike previous verses, this was intimate, almost melancholic. It hinted at closure, possibly retirement or escape. Investigators believed it to be a farewell from the Versero, but the recipient never testified. The merchant, once registered in Lisbon, had died in a warehouse fire just months before. Some suspected arson, others called it coincidence. No name was ever proven to be the Versero. No arrest was made. A quiet legacy. Despite never being caught, the impact of the Versero's methods began to ripple outward. Other smuggling groups, emboldened by the legend, attempted similar literary disguises, most without success. Investigators grew more vigilant, seizing not just goods but paper. A crackdown on poetic manifests was rumored in Hamburg and Genoa, and port officers were issued lists of suspicious phrases. One ironic result of this effort, a wave of false positives. Poems by innocent sailors, local romantics, and even religious texts were confiscated, misread as smuggling codes. In one case, a priest was detained for 3 days after customs officers mistook his translated psalms for hidden spice instructions. The more authorities sought to interpret metaphor as crime, the more chaos they caused. It was as if the versero had left behind a smokescreen one that blurred the lines between genuine art and illicit intention. A scholar's obsession. Luciana Rinaldi, the Genoese linguist, never gave up her pursuit. In the final years of her life, she published a slim, little-known book titled Stanzas of Salt and Smoke, an inquiry into poetic contraband. It documented her full analysis of the cipher system and included side-by-side comparisons of known versero poems with actual port logs. Her book proposed a radical theory, that the versero was not one man but a collective, a literary smuggling guild, multiple smugglers trained in the poetic code, operating under one name to confuse investigators. The style, after all, was consistent, but so were the patterns of shipment. This explained how the method endured across years and languages. Most scholars dismissed her claim, too elaborate, too romantic, but Rinaldi died believing it, and her notes remain archived in the University of Siena, studied today by crime historians and literary cryptographers alike. The modern footnote. You may be surprised to learn that the versero's story did not end in the 18th century. In 1992, a historian named Elena Ward uncovered a collection of unmarked maritime logs in a private archive in Amsterdam. Among them, a leather folio with a pressed flower inside. The ink was faded, but the contents unmistakable. The ink was sweet, the bark was dry. I kissed the stars where clove did lie. Ward published her findings in a small academic journal, reviving interest in the poetic smuggler. Since then, several international exhibits on historical crime have included reproductions of the versero's verses placed alongside the very goods he trafficked in: cloves, nutmeg, dried bark, and silken scarves. His legacy, strangely, is now one of admiration. He is studied not only as a criminal, but as a pioneer in coded communication, a figure who merged art and subversion with extraordinary finesse. The final image. And so we close our first story. Picture a dim candlelit chamber in an old port city. A man, or perhaps a woman, sits hunched over parchment, dipping a quill in ink laced with clove-scented oil. Outside, barrels shift in the dark, carried by men who know only that the verse must go with the cargo. This isn't just crime, it's theater. A crime staged in verse where the only witness is a poem, and the only evidence, a rhyme. A thought-provoking reflection. What does it mean when a crime is committed not through force but through metaphor? When the law must chase stanzas instead of footprints? And if a crime is beautiful, carefully written, masterfully hidden, does that make it less criminal, or more? Story 2. The Forgotten Bank Robbery of Shelbyville. You've likely never heard of Shelbyville, Kentucky, not unless you're from the region or make a habit of tracing forgotten places on maps. It's the kind of town people drive through, not to. But if you dig through courthouse records and brittle old newspapers, you'll find that in the summer of 1959, Shelbyville was the scene of a bank robbery so strange, so quietly executed, that it would vanish from headlines in a week and from public memory within a year. But the money was never found. No arrests were made. And the bank, it carried on, doors open, vault humming as if nothing had happened. Let's step into the town where everything was taken, but nothing seemed missing. The scene of the silence. In 1959, Shelbyville was a farming town with just under 7,000 residents. It had one high school, one courthouse, one jail with 4 cells, and one bank, First Farmers Trust and Reserve. A stone-faced building with heavy columns, a single vault, and a telltale green awning that had faded to gray under the Kentucky sun. The bank sat at the corner of Main and Washington. Across from it, a bakery, a barber shop, and most importantly, a sheriff's office that faced the bank directly. A location, one might assume, immune to crime by proximity alone. But that's the myth of small towns, isn't it? That everyone's watching. In truth, people only see what they're used to seeing. Anything out of place simply becomes invisible. Monday morning, July 6, 1959. It was the first business day after Independence Day weekend. The bank manager, Wendell Cross, opened the doors at 7:45 a.m. as he always did. By 8:00 a.m., two tellers and the assistant manager were present. By 9:00 a.m., customers began trickling in. At 11:12 a.m., Cross entered the vault to retrieve bonds needed for a local farmer's loan application. That's when he noticed it. The vault was missing $68,000. Not all the money, just the large denomination bills and reserve stock. Small bills, coins, and customer deposits remained untouched. There were no signs of forced entry. The steel door had been locked tight at close of business the previous Friday. The security guard hadn't noticed a thing. The vault's logs showed no tampering. No alarms had gone off. No one, it seemed, had broken in. Yet the cash was gone. No suspect, no sign. Cross called the Shelby County Sheriff's Office immediately. Sheriff Elton Broom, a large man with a slow voice and steady hands, walked across the street, entered the bank, and inspected the vault himself. "Looks like a ghost did it," he reportedly said. There were no fingerprints other than those belonging to authorized personnel. No boot prints, no fibers, no broken locks, no witnesses. An initial theory emerged: inside job. But every employee passed the polygraph test. No one had unusual debts. No one fled town. And perhaps most telling, no one acted differently. The mysterious man on the ledger. Investigators scoured security logs and customer ledgers from the days leading up to the robbery. There, in the July 2nd records, was a peculiar note. A deposit of $50 was made under the name David Graves. The name matched no one in town. The handwriting was unusually formal, like something copied from a textbook. The teller who received the deposit remembered only that the man wore brown gloves odd for July and spoke with a stiff, almost theatrical formality. He said, "Good day to you, miss," like it was a movie script, she later recalled. The $50 was in crisp new fives, which seemed unremarkable, until the bills were traced back to a shipment recently delivered to a bank in Cincinnati. Why would someone use out-of-town bills to open a small deposit account in a town they didn't live in? The note of David Graves would be the only external trace ever linked to the crime. The vault's quirk. Digging deeper into the mechanics of the vault revealed something curious. Unlike more modern safes, the vault at First Farmers Trust used a dual-dial mechanism, two combination locks that required separate inputs, one from the manager, one from the assistant manager. In theory, both parties needed to be present to open the vault. But in practice, the system had a reset glitch. When the vault's right-hand dial was left slightly ajar, a quirk known to veteran locksmiths, it could be reopened with only a partial sequence. This flaw wasn't widely known outside of certain safecracker circles, but one man knew it intimately: a locksmith named Harlan Keene, who had serviced the vault back in 1954 when it jammed after a thunderstorm. Harlan, however, had died in 1957, or so everyone thought. The obituary that vanished. 2 years before the robbery, a newspaper clipping reported Keene's death cause unknown, body cremated, next of kin listed as none. But when investigators requested the official death certificate from the state records office, they were told no such document existed. The coroner's report was missing. The crematorium had no receipt. And no one in Shelbyville recalled attending a funeral. So who wrote the obituary? and who verified the death. When authorities dug further, they found that the notice had been submitted by a payphone call made from 80 miles away from a Greyhound station in Bowling Green. The caller used a pseudonym, Harold Kane, a name suspiciously similar to Harlan Keene. Was the man alive, walking under a new name? Or had someone else used his knowledge and his identity to get close to the vault? A town that moved on. Within a month, the FBI dropped the case for lack of actionable leads. Insurance covered the loss. No suspect was ever charged. The staff was retained and the vault was replaced. But the story didn't disappear entirely. Local kids began using David Graves as a sort of ghost story. Don't leave your allowance out, or Graves will get it. And old-timers at the diner would lower their voices and say, "They let him take it. Mark my words, they let him." But there was never proof. An unresolved thought. Was the vault robbed by a dead man with a locksmith's memory? Or was it never a robbery at all, just an elegant removal, coordinated by people who wanted it to disappear quietly? And if so, how many small-town crimes go unnoticed because everyone agrees consciously or not to forget? There's something different about a crime that leaves no scars. No broken glass, no torn paper, no screams, no chase, just absence. A hole in the books. A name that doesn't belong. A vault that was sealed and then somehow wasn't. In this section, we pull closer to the strange, silent heart of the Shelbyville robbery, where the few remaining clues point toward a man who may not have existed and a bank that may not have cared. Let's follow the footsteps that don't leave prints. The ghost of Harlan Keene. After discovering that no official death record existed for locksmith Harlan Keene, Sheriff Elton Broom reopened the case with quiet determination. He had worked in Shelbyville for 19 years and believed in logic, in clean books. But this robbery refused to stay within the lines. Keene, as it turned out, was not your typical tradesman. Born in 1910 in Memphis, Tennessee, he'd apprenticed under a German locksmith who had immigrated after the First World War. By age 27, Keene was considered one of the finest precision lock mechanics in the southern states. He was famous among security vendors and notorious among certain career burglars. The connection. He had once been implicated in an insurance fraud ring out of Chattanooga. A vault he installed for a furniture warehouse had been accidentally left vulnerable, resulting in a fire and a successful insurance claim. Charges were never filed, but Keene moved states shortly after. He arrived in Shelbyville in 1950 under quiet circumstances, lived alone, drank at one bar, paid in cash, serviced safes and locks in 7 counties. Then in 1957 he supposedly died, a tidy death, no body, no funeral. And yet, in August 1959, just 1 month after the Shelbyville robbery, someone reported a near-identical crime 300 miles away in southern Illinois. A bank's vault was breached with no sign of entry, and $42,000 in bearer bonds vanished. The vault had by coincidence been serviced by a Mr. Keene 5 years prior. The MO matched Shelbyville's theft exactly. But no fingerprints, no camera footage, no suspect. And again, the money was never recovered. Letters without postmarks. Sheriff Broom, now increasingly obsessed, reached out to federal agencies and regional precincts to build a map of vault jobs tied to Keene over the past 2 decades. Of the 14 banks he had worked on, 3 had been robbed, all quietly, all unsolved, all within 6 years of his service. But the real twist came from a private investigator named James Krause, hired in 1960 by a competing locksmith company. Krause had collected rumors that Keene was alive living in South Texas, going by the name Hal Kearns. Krause received 2 anonymous letters during his investigation. The envelopes were typed, the paper unmarked, and the messages were short, each no more than 3 lines. But they said the same thing. You don't find vaults open. You open them wrong. H. The letters contained no postmark, no return address, no date. They appeared one in Krause's office. One slipped under his car windshield without anyone seeing who delivered them. Krause kept the letters, but he never found Keene, and 6 months after the second letter, he abandoned the case, claiming that he felt watched. A bank with secrets of its own. Let's return to Shelbyville. While all eyes focused on the vanished locksmith, few looked hard at the bank itself. First Farmers Trust and Reserve was more than just a rural depository. In 1957, just 2 years before the robbery, it had quietly taken on a private contract with a state-level agricultural fund processing reserve funds related to farm equipment loans and seed subsidies. This was rare for a bank of its size and location. Stranger still, the contract included no oversight clause. What did that mean? It meant that $80,000 in public funds had moved through the Shelbyville vault with no requirement of external audit. And the $68,000 that vanished, it had been part of that very same reserve. So now the question becomes, was this a case of external theft, or an internal disappearance laundered through a robbery that was never meant to be solved? Wendell Cross and the quiet promotion. Bank manager Wendell Cross, the man who discovered the theft, had been with First Farmers for 12 years. Conservative, well-liked, methodical. But one detail raised eyebrows. 3 months after the robbery, Cross accepted a position with a Louisville investment firm, a move that stunned locals. He sold his home and moved with his wife to the city. The investment firm. It had strong ties to agricultural lending. In fact, it handled the very same public funds rooted through Shelbyville's vault. The job came with a salary 3 times what Cross had been earning. Publicly, the bank said the theft was unrelated to his departure. Privately, some whispered that Cross had known more than he let on, and that the robbery was a cover for a state-sponsored mishandling of funds. No evidence was ever filed against him, but Cross never returned to Shelbyville, not even to visit family. He died in 1997, never speaking about the case again. A handwritten ledger. In 1973, long after the case had been forgotten by most, a former janitor at the bank, Mavis Torrens, contacted a local journalist. She was dying of heart disease and claimed to have kept a ledger of all vault activity for 3 years in the late 50s, as part of an informal task given by the assistant manager. Why? Because they were concerned the vault's logs weren't accurate. They believed money was moving in and out outside of normal banking hours. Torrens' ledger, a small notebook now housed in a historical archive, includes 3 entries marked only with a red X, no date, no signature. Each X was followed by this note: heard latch, no one on shift. The most recent of those entries, July 3, 1959, the Friday before the theft, the case that stopped moving. After 1960, no further investigations were opened. The FBI archived the case under non-recoverable. The town quietly removed references to the incident from their Chamber of Commerce brochures. No anniversary stories were printed. No documentaries made. To this day, no photograph of Harlan Keene has been conclusively verified, and no trace of the $68,000 has surfaced. Not a bill, not a bond, not a fingerprint. Only stories, whispers, letters typed without dates. A cliffhanger in disguise. Was the robbery a one-man job, pulled off by a locksmith presumed dead? Or was he just a shadow used as a scapegoat for a quiet, inside deal? And if the vault was opened from the inside, who really held the key? Sleepy crimes don't always mean innocent ones. Some disappear not because they've been solved, but because solving them would mean unraveling too much. When crimes are tidy, no violence, no bodies, no suspects, they're often left in history's dustpan. This final chapter peels back the last layers of the Shelbyville robbery. exposing a slow conspiracy that never made the papers, and a silence that may have been intentional all along. Let's return to the town that never said what it knew. The quietest cold case. By the 1970s, the Shelbyville vault robbery had become a ghost in Kentucky law enforcement circles, occasionally referenced during training on internal control failures, but never actively pursued. The lack of physical evidence was often cited as the reason, but insiders believed otherwise. Former FBI analyst Darrell Choate, in a 1988 lecture on financial crimes, brought up Shelbyville briefly during a Q&A. He described it as one of the only cases where everyone involved stopped asking questions at the same time. The tone, he said, came from the top. He claimed that several regional officials had pushed to shelve the case because they feared it would expose misallocated state funds and unauthorized financial instruments used during the Eisenhower-era agricultural programs. Essentially, the stolen money may not have just disappeared, it may have never been real in the first place, at least not on the public books. According to Choate, the robbery may have been a correction, a method to remove money that was created for one thing but used for another. The smoking memo. In 1993, a declassified batch of state banking oversight records surfaced during a public audit. Among them was a typed memo dated September 1959, just 2 months after the robbery. The memo, sent from a regional controller's office to a senior advisor in Frankfurt, read, "Shelbyville incident neutralized. Recommend no further scrutiny. Personnel reassigned quietly." There was no official header, no signatures, but it had one name at the bottom typed, not signed. W. Cross. The memo was the only known government document linking Wendell Cross to post-robbery communications. The state denied any knowledge of the message, but its language was clear. Neutralized implied a crime had occurred. No further scrutiny implied someone higher up wanted it buried. The robbery may have been an inside operation authorized, or at least tolerated, by elements within the state itself. The man in the photograph. Let's go back to Harlan Keene, or maybe not. In 2001, a photograph surfaced in a used bookstore in Abilene, Texas. The image, tucked into a copy of American Safe and Vault Mechanisms, showed a group of 8 men standing outside a locksmith trade conference in Phoenix, 1964. On the back, written in blue pen, "To Ray from your old pals, Phoenix, 64. One of the men bore a striking resemblance to the only surviving sketch of Harlan Keene, an image drawn from memory by a Shelbyville bartender in 1955. When the photo was examined by facial recognition software decades later, there was a 71% probability it matched Keene's known likeness. But Keene was declared dead in 1957. So who was the man in the photograph? Was it him alive, under another name, attending conferences openly? Or had the identity of Harlan Keene been borrowed by someone else, just as the crime had borrowed his expertise? If he did live, he never left another trace, not one that was documented. A community's amnesia. Shelbyville's population grew. The bank changed names twice and was absorbed by a regional credit union. The vault was removed, replaced with digital security and passcodes. No plaque, no newspaper tribute, no archival mention of what occurred. For a crime involving nearly $70,000, a staggering amount in 1959, it was strange how cleanly the memory was erased. Historian Alina Sanford, who compiled a 2015 oral history of Shelbyville for a state project, interviewed 37 residents over the age of 75. Only 3 remembered the robbery, and only 1 could recall the name David Graves. That man, now passed, simply said, "Graves, that fella wasn't real. That was a story we told so people wouldn't ask about the other thing." When pressed on what the other thing was, he smiled, shook his head, and said, I've lived a good long life by not asking where the money went. We often assume that stolen money is spent, that it fuels a criminal's life, cars, properties, vices. But in the Shelbyville case, no large purchases were ever reported in town. No unexplained fortunes, no new vehicles, no land transfers. The cash was just gone. Economist Lars Entwell studied the case in 2007 as part of a broader project on untraceable capital. His conclusion: the money was likely injected back into rural lending programs via shell banks, essentially laundered into legitimacy. No one got rich, but someone got clean. It was not a crime of greed. It was a crime of correction, a silent balancing of an unspoken debt, a legacy in dust. The original vault is now a historical artifact. In 2021, it was recovered from a salvage yard and displayed at a small museum in Louisville. Next to it, a modest placard. This vault stood at the heart of Shelbyville's only unsolved bank disappearance. It was never broken, but it was beaten. Visitors rarely linger there. It's not flashy. There's no shootout, no wanted poster, no notorious face behind bars. But it is, in many ways, the perfect crime. A theft that left no damage. A vault that was never forced. A town that never resisted. A final reflection. What do we make of crimes that resolve themselves? That vanish not because they're solved, but because we choose not to solve them. Is silence complicity or just survival? And how many more towns like Shelbyville, quiet, obedient, ordinary, are home to histories that no one dares to write down? Story 3. The Watchmaker Who Forged Time. Time doesn't tick the same way for everyone. For some, it's measured in heartbeats. For others, in money. But for one man, an unassuming horologist from a quiet Swiss town, time was a tool, a weapon, a way to manipulate trust, guarantee transactions, and vanish before anyone noticed. This is the story of Anselmi Roth, a master watchmaker who learned how to forge more than timepieces. He forged time itself and used it to walk through borders, falsify financial records, and defraud some of Europe's most prestigious institutions. His victims trusted the ticking. They should have listened closer. The Quiet Craftsman of Neuchâtel. Neuchâtel, nestled among the Jura Mountains of western Switzerland, has long been a cradle for precision engineering. It's a place where clocks are passed down through generations like sacred relics, and where watchmakers are spoken of with a reverence reserved for surgeons and priests. Anselmi Roth arrived in Neuchâtel in 1968. He rented a second-story apartment above a cheese shop, paid 3 months' rent in advance, and registered a one-man watchmaking business under the name Roth & Co. Precision Instruments. But there was no Co. Just Roth. Tall, gaunt, with circular spectacles and fingers that seemed too long even for his lean frame. Roth worked with the meticulous devotion of a monk. Local clients praised his ability to restore delicate 19th century timepieces that even the National Horological Museum had declined to service. But beneath the magnifying glass and the smell of old oil, Roth was building something else entirely. Clocks that didn't tell the truth. In early 1971, a regional bank manager in Lausanne noticed something strange. A loan had been processed with a timestamp that predated its deposit by 2 days. This wouldn't be remarkable if not for the fact that both actions occurred in person. With time-stamped verification from a mechanical watch the client had used to validate the transaction. It was dismissed as clerical error. But then another case appeared. And another. Each time the discrepancy was small minutes, then hours, then days. Always in favor of the client. Always verified by Roth manufactured watches. That's when Swiss financial investigator began to quietly probe Roth's business. What they uncovered would take years to fully understand. The watch with 2 faces. Roth was not merely a repairman. He was an inventor, and his invention was astonishing. He had created a mechanical dual timing movement, a system where a watch could be manually or magnetically flipped between two synchronized but offset time states. One face would show the official time. The other, hidden within the mechanism, would log transactions at an earlier or later time depending on how the wearer manipulated it. The movement could be toggled using a specific pressure point on the crown, something imperceptible to an untrained handler. Why did this matter? Because in a world still transitioning to digital records, mechanical verification was king. Timestamps from luxury timepieces were often used to validate delivery of goods, finalize notary filings, or confirm payment deadlines, especially in international trade and rare asset exchanges. If someone could falsify time, they could backdate contracts, they could postdate debt, they could erase late fees, dodge taxes, or fake alibis. Roth's clients, some knowingly, some not, had begun using these altered watches to reshape reality. A con with no name. The authorities had a dilemma. Roth had broken no obvious laws. Selling a modified watch wasn't in itself illegal. And the clients, many of them had used the watches for micro-fraud, dodging delivery fees, shifting insurance dates, skirting customs taxes. Small crimes spread wide. There was no smoking gun, no single fraud that could be pinned directly on Roth. And yet the damage was measurable. By 1973, at least 12 separate companies, from insurance firms to freight brokers, had reported time discrepancies linked to Roth watches. But Roth, he remained serene. His ledgers were perfect, his taxes paid, his clients discreet. When interviewed informally, he simply said, "Time is not fixed. Why should clocks be?" The Rome shipment. In 1974, Roth's operation reached its apex with a single case that finally crossed into prosecutable territory. An Italian jewelry house in Rome used a Roth-engineered watch to validate the shipping time of a €4 million diamond consignment. The timepiece confirmed the goods were shipped 48 hours before the deadline required by their insurance policy, thus protecting them from a late penalty. But when the shipment arrived damaged, and the insurer launched an investigation, they found that the watch had been altered. The insurer's internal horologist took apart the timepiece and discovered the dual-state movement. At last, Roth's invention was exposed not just as clever, but as instrumental to a high-value fraud. A warrant was issued for Roth's arrest. Swiss police raided his workshop in Neuchâtel. But Roth wasn't there. His apartment was clean, his bench was bare, his business license formally closed. He had vanished. A letter left behind. All they found in Roth's empty drawers was a single envelope, addressed to no one in particular. It contained a note, handwritten in blue ink. "Time, like money, is a construct. If I forged it, it's only because it was never real. The tick lies as easily as the tongue." Darn. Roth was never seen again. Interpol placed him on an international watch list for fraud by technological deception, a newly coined term, but no bank accounts were found. No property, no partners, no sign of his destination. Only the watches remained. An unresolved thought. If time can be manipulated, can truth? And how many deals, how many crimes, how many missed arrests slipped by not through force, but through a tick that lied? You already know how it began with a man who twisted gears until truth bent alongside them. But what you don't yet know is how far the ripples of his inventions traveled. After his disappearance in 1974, Roth's watches didn't vanish with him. They spread quietly into the bloodstream of European commerce, and with every tick, they reshaped contracts, shifted alibis, and erased accountability. Let's follow the trail of a vanished watchmaker, through the crimes that bore his fingerprints, even when he himself was nowhere to be found. The dispersal of the watches. When Roth vanished from Neuchâtel, he left behind no workshop, no unfinished projects. But investigators later discovered that at least 45 watches bearing his modified movements had already been sold, gifted, or bartered. Unlike traditional luxury timepieces, they weren't flashy. They bore plain dials, simple steel cases, and unremarkable branding. Many were engraved only with the letters R and Co., a name that looked legitimate enough but could not be traced to any established manufacturer. Collectors who later studied these pieces noted that Roth's genius was in their subtlety. The modifications were invisible unless one dismantled the entire movement. To the casual observer, they were simply unbranded, mid-range watches. But to the initiated, they were keys to bending reality. Case file: the Antwerp diamonds. In 1976, 2 years after Roth's disappearance, Antwerp police investigated a suspicious diamond transaction. A dealer had sold stones to an American buyer who presented proof of payment dated March 2nd. Yet the dealer's own ledger showed the transfer occurred on March 4th, 2 days late. The discrepancy was small, but significant enough to void certain tax exemptions. The buyer produced a wristwatch that confirmed the earlier date. It was one of Roth. When authorities opened the watch, they found the telltale dual-state gear. The buyer claimed ignorance. "I bought this in Zurich. I thought it was normal." The dealer sued, but the case collapsed. The watch provided reasonable doubt. The diamonds left Belgium, and Roth's invention was blamed for a fraud worth millions. Case file: the Vienna alibi. 3 years later, in 1979, Roth's watches appeared in a darker context. A Viennese businessman, Otto Keller, was accused of embezzlement. When auditors uncovered missing funds, Keller presented meeting logs and a time-stamped signature, all corroborated by the watch on his wrist. But investigators noticed something odd. Witnesses placed Keller at a different location during those hours. When forensic examiners dismantled his watch, they uncovered the second timing mechanism. Keller was convicted, but what made headlines was not his guilt, it was the revelation that Roth watches, as they were now called in the press, were being used to create false alibis. Suddenly, every unexplained timestamp in courtrooms across Europe became suspect. The myth of Roth. By the 1980s, Roth had become less a man and more a myth. Journalists speculated that he was living under a false name in South America, perhaps still making watches for a circle of elite clients. Others argued he had been killed by one of the very syndicates that profited from his devices. The absence of a body, or even a credible sighting, only fueled the legend. But one clue surfaced in 1984 in Buenos Aires. A customs raid on a smuggling ring uncovered 3 unmarked watches, all with Roth's dual-state movement. Alongside them was a letter, unsigned, written in German. "Time is our shield, use it carefully." The handwriting matched Roth's farewell note found in Neuchâtel. Did this mean he was alive, or were his words merely copied by those who admired his craft? No one could say for certain. A conspiracy of silence. Law enforcement agencies grew frustrated. Proving fraud tied to Roth watches required catching both the watch and the wearer in the act. By then, most transactions were increasingly digital, making his devices less directly useful. Yet, in the shadows, especially in smuggling, art theft, and tax evasion, they remained invaluable. A 1987 Europol briefing referred to Roth's devices as horological contraband and warned. Possession is not illegal, use is not traceable, yet effect is undeniable. Banks began banning mechanical timepieces as proof of contract. Court systems moved toward notarized stamps. Insurance companies demanded multiple witnesses instead of relying on clocks. In short, institutions changed their practices because of one man. The collector's market. Ironically, as Roth's devices lost their criminal value, they gained another kind of worth: collectability. By the 1990s, whispers spread through horology circles of mysterious dual-train watches created by a vanished genius. Some collectors paid fortunes for them, claiming they were the rarest movements of the 20th century. But many of these buyers never knew the truth that the watches weren't curiosities. They were the residue of crimes, once used to shift fortunes and erase accountability. One London dealer said privately in 1992, "Every Roth watch is soaked in fraud. They are relics of deception." The unanswered question, the central mystery remains. Was Roth himself behind the continuing distribution of his devices after 1974, or had his methods been adopted and copied by others? The precision required to make the dual-train movement was immense. Few could replicate it without direct training. That suggests either Roth was alive, still supplying the underworld, or he had passed his knowledge on deliberately. But to whom? An apprentice? A client? A syndicate? No evidence ever surfaced. The shadow of time. By the close of the 20th century, Roth had become both a footnote in criminal history and a whispered legend among watchmakers. He blurred the line between art and fraud, between timekeeping and time forging. His story leaves us with an unsettling truth. When we anchor ourselves to clocks, we assume they are impartial. But what if they lie? What if every second, every timestamp, every signed hour has a shadow version, one that says something else entirely? Roth's watches remind us that trust is fragile, that even something as universal as time can be manipulated. A cliffhanger. If Roth disappeared, leaving only his inventions behind, then who was still writing letters, still circulating his devices years later? Was it him, or was his ghost being kept alive by those who had every reason to forge more than time? You followed the trail of a man who bent time to his will, who turned the tick of a clock into a weapon sharper than any blade. Now, in this last section, we unravel the final threads of Anselm Roth's story, where fact dissolves into legend, where watches become relics, and where the crime lingers even after the criminal disappears. The Interpol dossier. In 1998, after years of fragmented reports, Interpol compiled a confidential dossier on Roth. The file was slim, only 47 pages, but it contained every known case tied to his modified watches. It listed 17 confirmed frauds across 8 countries, ranging from backdated insurance claims to art smuggling. But the file's most haunting section was titled Post-Disappearance Sightings. 1978, Zurich. A banker claimed to have met Roth at a clock fair, introducing himself under the name Hans Roeder. 1981, Madrid. A Roth-style watch was seized during a heroin bust. 1984, Buenos Aires. The German-language note referencing time as our shield. 1991, Prague. An anonymous tip suggested Roth was training a new generation of watchmakers for political clients. None of these were verified, but each kept the myth alive. The apprentice theory. Among watchmakers, there is an unproven but persistent theory. Roth did not vanish, he taught. A retired Swiss horologist, Emile Trosset, claimed in a 2003 interview that Roth once hinted at taking on a pupil before leaving Neuchâtel. This apprentice, Roth said, would ensure time's other version survived. Trosset admitted he never knew if it was true, but in the 1990s, several watches appeared on the black market that bore Roth's signature dual movement, yet with subtle differences. The craftsmanship wasn't quite as perfect. The offset was clumsier, almost as if they were made by someone who had learned the method secondhand. If there was an apprentice, they never came forward. Perhaps they were just a shadow to Roth's already shadowy figure. The New York auction. In 2007, Sotheby's New York shocked the horological world by auctioning an unbranded 1970s wristwatch with a dual-train mechanism. The catalog made no reference to Roth, but collectors recognized the style instantly. The watch sold for $312,010 times the estimated price. The buyer remained anonymous, but afterward, 3 more Roth watches surfaced in auctions across Europe. Their provenance was murky. Each was linked to estates of businessmen with vague or suspicious financial pasts. It was as if Roth's devices were finally resurfacing not as tools of crime, but as artifacts of it. The case that couldn't be tried. In 2012, a corporate lawsuit in Germany briefly dragged Roth's name back into the public eye. A logistics firm was accused of falsifying shipment dates to avoid penalties. When investigators dismantled the CEO's vintage wristwatch, they found Roth's unmistakable mechanism inside. But here was the problem. Possession of the watch was not illegal, nor was wearing it. Unless investigators could prove the CEO had knowingly manipulated the offset mechanism during a contract, the evidence meant nothing. The case collapsed. The CEO walked free, and Roth's legend grew even darker because his crime, decades later, was still unprosecutable. The philosophical question. Criminal historians now ask a question about Roth that few other criminals invite. Was he truly a fraudster, or was he a philosopher? His farewell letter, "Time, like money, is a construct," suggests he didn't see his work as deception. To him, he was exposing the fragility of human systems, showing how easily the anchors of society could be shifted by a simple turn of gears. But intent doesn't erase impact. His devices cost insurers millions, freed guilty men from punishment, and enabled smuggling operations that still ripple in records today. Perhaps Roth was both, a craftsman who asked questions and a criminal who answered them with lies. The tick that never ends. Today, fewer than 20 Roth watches are believed to exist. Most are locked away in private collections, traded quietly at absurd prices. Museums have declined to exhibit them, wary of glamorizing fraud. But in certain courtrooms, especially in Europe, the phrase "a Roth watch" has become shorthand for any piece of evidence that might be falsified by clever manipulation. His name has become a metaphor, detached from the man himself. Anselm Roth, the quiet craftsman from Neuchâtel, is now both myth and cautionary tale. He is the man who proved that even time, our most trusted constant, can be forged. A final reflection. Imagine this. Somewhere in a dusty drawer, a Roth watch still ticks. The gears move, the seconds pass, and the hands glide forward. But under the dial, another clock is waiting. A hidden version of time, ready to rewrite the truth with the flick of a crown. So we must ask ourselves, if time itself can be falsified, what else do we build our lives on that is just as fragile, just as easily bent? Story 4. The small-town doctor's poison cabinet. In the quiet corners of rural towns, a doctor is more than a physician. He is confidant, counselor, sometimes priest. His presence soothes, his prescriptions reassure, his authority is rarely questioned. But what happens when the hand that heals begins to harm? When the cabinet of cures becomes a chest of poisons? This is the story of Dr. Thomas Ellery, a country doctor in mid-20th century America whose patients trusted him completely until whispers spread that too many were dying, and too many bottles in his office bore labels that didn't match their contents. It is the story of a healer who may have been a killer. The town of Millstone. Millstone, Ohio, was a farming town of no more than 3,200 residents in the 1940s. It had one school, one bank, 3 churches, and a modest white brick clinic at the edge of Main Street. The clinic's brass plaque read, "Thomas Ellery, M.D. Family Practice." Dr. Ellery had arrived in 1936, fresh from a residency in Cleveland. His reputation spread quickly. He made house calls in winter storms, delivered bobbies in barns, and was known to waive fees for families struggling with the Depression. By the mid-1940s, he was the most trusted man in Millstone. Yet in a town so small, numbers don't lie. Between 1940 and 1947, Millstone's mortality rate rose steadily, outpacing surrounding towns. Adults in their 40s and 50s died of sudden heart failure. Children succumbed to mysterious fevers. Widows wept while Ellery signed their husbands' death certificates with tidy penmanship. At first, no one questioned him. He was the doctor, he knew best. But then came the poison cabinet. The locked cupboard. In 1948, a janitor cleaning the clinic after hours noticed a small cabinet in Ellery's private office. It was locked with a brass key, separate from the medicine shelves used for everyday treatments. Curious, the janitor later told neighbors that he had peeked inside one day when Ellery left the door ajar. What he saw unsettled him. Bottles labeled with strange names: strychnine, digitalis, arsenic trioxide. Labels marked not with dosage instructions but with numbers and letters, like coded recipes. The janitor said nothing at first. After all, doctors kept dangerous substances. But he mentioned it once to his wife, who repeated it at church, and within weeks the phrase Ellery's poison cabinet became whispered shorthand in Millstone. The whispers might have died down, if not for the funeral of Margaret Crane, the widow who died twice. Margaret Crane was 62, a widow who lived alone in a farmhouse outside Millstone. By all accounts, she was healthy and strong, still tending her garden and baking pies for church fundraisers. In March 1949, she visited Dr. Ellery for dizziness. He prescribed a tonic. Within a week, she was dead. The town grieved. Ellery signed the certificate, heart failure. But at her funeral, neighbors noticed something odd. Crane's lips bore a faint bluish tint and her fingernails were discolored. One woman whispered, "That looks like poisoning." The rumor spread, and this time the sheriff, pressed by the town council, ordered an inquiry. Crane's body was quietly exhumed. Tissue samples were sent to Columbus. The report came back: arsenic detected in lethal quantity. The case was now undeniable, and the first suspect was the man who had prescribed her last medicine. The investigation begins. When authorities entered Ellery's clinic with a warrant, they found the infamous cabinet exactly as described. Inside were not only poisons, but handwritten formulas, slips of paper with initials of patients and notes like MC 3 grains diluted, LW nightly until cessation, CR avoid witness. The initials matched local deaths. MC was Margaret Crane. LW was Louis Whitaker, a farmer who had collapsed suddenly in 1946. CR was Clara Reynolds, a young woman who had died in her sleep at age 29. Ellery denied everything. He claimed the notes were experimental drafts for theoretical dosing, part of his ongoing medical studies. The poisons, he argued, were common tools of physicians before modern regulation. Arsenic, after all, had once been prescribed for syphilis. Digitalis, derived from foxglove, was still used for heart conditions. Poison, he said in court, is just a matter of quantity. Medicine in one dose, death in another. But the town was no longer convinced. The trial of the doctor. Ellery was charged with the murder of Margaret Crane and suspicion in at least 4 other deaths. The courtroom in Columbus was packed with journalists, fascinated by the case of a country doctor turned suspected poisoner. The prosecution presented the cabinet, the formulas, and testimony from grieving families. They painted a picture of a man who had grown arrogant with power, experimenting on his patients, deciding who would live and who would die. The defense argued Ellery was a victim of circumstance, a dedicated doctor whose cabinet was misconstrued, whose patients' deaths reflected the poor health conditions of rural America, not malice. But the most haunting moment came when a chemist demonstrated in front of the jury how the tonic prescribed to Margaret Crane contained arsenic levels 5 times higher than therapeutic use. The mixture was not accidental, it was deliberate. The verdict. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 14 hours. On October 12, 1949, Dr. Thomas Ellery was convicted of second-degree murder. Yet here lies the twist. The sentence was remarkably light. He received 20 years in prison, eligible for parole in 12. Prosecutors had pushed for first degree, but the jury balked at condemning a man who had once saved their children, delivered their relatives, and served their town through storms and epidemics. In Millstone, the reaction was divided. Some cursed his name, refusing to speak it again. Others swore he had been framed, that his cabinet was misread, that the state had made an example of a small-town doctor. And through it all, Ellery himself maintained his innocence. An unresolved thought. Was Ellery truly a cold-blooded poisoner, experimenting on those who trusted him? Or was he a man trapped by circumstance, a doctor whose tools were misunderstood in an age when the line between medicine and poison was razor-thin? The cabinet held the answers, but did it hold the truth? When a man who wears the white coat of trust is unmasked, the shock lingers long after the gavel falls. Dr. Thomas Ellery entered prison in 1949 as a convicted murderer, but he never stopped claiming he was simply a misunderstood physician, condemned by ignorance and fear. Meanwhile, back in Millstone, his absence did not erase the unease, it deepened it. This section explores what became of Ellery behind bars, how his conviction unsettled his hometown, and why whispers of his poison cabinet refused to fade even decades later. Arrival at Chillicothe Penitentiary. Ellery was sent to Chillicothe Penitentiary, a sprawling brick complex in southern Ohio that housed everyone from petty thieves to lifers. Unlike other prisoners, Ellery had an unusual advantage: his medical skills. Within months, he was assisting in the prison infirmary, setting bones, prescribing sedatives, and ironically dispensing medicine. Guards respected him. Inmates sought him out. Some even called him Doc, a title he wore like armor. He walked the yard with calm authority, always composed, spectacles gleaming in the sun. But beneath that calm exterior, prison records reveal an unusual detail. Ellery requested access to medical texts on toxicology and forensic chemistry. He said it was for his own education. The warden allowed it. It was as if he wanted to perfect the very knowledge that had condemned him. Letters from a cell. During his incarceration, Ellery wrote over 200 letters, some to family, many to medical journals, and a surprising number to journalists. In them, he repeated the same refrain: "I never poisoned anyone. I prescribed medicine as was common practice. The world chose to see poison because they no longer trust the physician's hand." He argued that his cabinet contained nothing illegal for the time. He claimed the formulas marked with initials were case studies, not prescriptions. And yet in other letters, his language turned darker. "I learned more in 3 years of practice than most men do in a lifetime. You cannot treat the body without understanding how close it always is to death. To heal, one must court the edge of poison. To kill, one only has to step a little further." These words, later published in fragments, fed the myth of Ellery as a man who believed himself not just a healer, but an arbiter deciding how far that line should go. The deaths that preceded Margaret Crane. Meanwhile, back in Millstone, researchers and journalists began combing through old death records. What they found suggested Crane may not have been the first or the last of Ellery's victims. Louis Whitaker, 1946, sudden heart failure after tonic treatment, autopsy never performed. Clara Reynolds, 1947, young woman, mysterious nighttime death, prescribed nerve tincture by Ellery. Samuel Pike, 1948, Local storekeeper. Death certificate listed circulatory collapse. Ellery had provided laudanum. Each case was quietly accepted at the time, but hindsight combined with the discovery of Ellery's coded notes made them look more sinister. The state reopened 3 of these cases, exhumed remains, and performed tests. Only Samuel Pike showed measurable traces of digitalis. The others had decomposed too far for conclusive analysis. 3 names, 1 confirmed, dozens suspected. The legend of the poisoned doctor grew. The town's uneasy silence. In Millstone, reactions remained divided. Some former patients insisted Ellery had saved their lives and was wrongly accused. Others avoided mentioning him altogether, as though silence could exorcise his memory. Local newspapers stopped covering the story by the mid-1950s, focusing instead on farm policy and church socials. But in private conversations, the case lingered. Children dared one another to peer into the abandoned clinic, whispering that the poison cabinet was still inside, bottles glowing faintly in the dark. The building was eventually sold, the cabinet destroyed, but the memory of it rows of bottles with deadly contents haunted the town's imagination. Parole and release. In 1961, after serving 12 years, Ellery was granted parole for good behavior and medical service to inmates. He was 58 years old. The parole board's decision was controversial. Families of victims protested, but the state argued he had served his minimum term and posed no present danger. Ellery left prison quietly, with no money, no license to practice medicine, and no intention of returning to Millstone. He moved to Dayton, Ohio, where he lived in a boarding house under supervision. Journalists hounded him briefly, but he refused interviews. One neighbor recalled. He was polite, kept to himself, read medical books all the time, but you could tell his mind was somewhere else, always calculating. The second poison cabinet. In 1963, 2 years after his release, Dayton police investigated the mysterious death of a tenant in Ellery's boarding house. The man, age 42, had collapsed after drinking homemade cough syrup provided by Ellery. An autopsy found elevated levels of strychnine. Police questioned Ellery, who admitted sharing medicine but denied wrongdoing. With no surviving evidence of deliberate dosing, and given his parole restrictions, charges were never filed. Yet the local press whispered, Ellery has another cabinet. Parole officers tightened supervision. Ellery was warned, but once again nothing could be proven. The final years. Ellery lived until 1974, when he died of a stroke in his boarding room at age 71. Among his belongings were only a few books, some medical notes, and a single locked box. Inside the box, glass vials, powders, and handwritten formulas resembling those from his old clinic. The state burned the contents, but the legend remained intact. A cliffhanger in retrospect. Was Ellery truly a monster, a doctor who preyed on trust to experiment with poisons? Or was he an ordinary physician caught between old practices and new regulations, punished not for killing, but for being careless with deadly tools? The answer depends on how you read his notes. Cures written in one light, poisons in another. When history remembers killers, it often remembers the obvious: the gunman, the thief, the man who leaves blood on the floor. But the more chilling figures are sometimes those who kill invisibly, hidden behind the trust of their neighbors. Dr. Thomas Ellery's story is not only about what he did, but what it revealed: the fragile boundary between medicine and murder, and how society chooses to define each. This final section uncovers Ellery's legacy, the lasting suspicion he cast over small-town medicine, and the haunting reflection left behind in his notebooks. The return to Millstone. After Ellery's death in 1974, the town of Millstone remained strangely silent. His name was seldom spoken in public. The clinic building, long since converted into a dental office, stood innocuous on Main Street, but the memory of the poison cabinet never truly disappeared. In interviews conducted decades later, residents recalled the unease. "We never trusted doctors the same way again," one man said. "When my son was sick, I thought about what Ellery gave people. I asked more questions," another woman admitted. The irony was clear. Ellery may have saved countless lives through ordinary treatment, but the suspicion that he had taken others created a shadow that outlived him. In Millstone, his ghost wasn't in the cemetery, it was in the doctor's waiting room. The notes that survived. Among Ellery's few possessions at his death were handwritten notebooks. The state destroyed many of them, fearing they contained dangerous formulations, but 3 volumes ended up in the archives of Ohio State University. Scholars who later examined them were unsettled. The notebooks were divided into 2 columns. On the left, therapeutic doses; on the right, lethal equivalents. Every entry listed a substance followed by 2 sets of numbers: digitalis, strychnine, arsenic, morphine. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant. One page bore the inscription: "To treat is to stand at the edge of a cliff. Every cure is a poison. The question is, how far do you lean forward?" Were these the musings of a thoughtful doctor, acknowledging the fine balance of medicine, or the calculations of a man fascinated with pushing patients over that edge? The line between the two is razor thin. The cases that couldn't be tried. Years after Ellery's conviction, investigative journalists revisited the town's mortality records. They identified at least 13 suspicious deaths between 1940 and 1948, patients who died suddenly under Ellery's care, often after being prescribed tonics or tinctures. But by the time suspicion turned to evidence, the graves were too old. Decomposition had erased proof. These deaths became ghost cases, lives lost without verdict, stories without closure. Ellery had been convicted for Margaret Crane, but how many more names might have belonged on the indictment? 10, 20, we'll never know. A divided legacy. Medical historians still debate Ellery's case. Some argue he was a true poisoner, a predator who exploited trust for his own fascination with toxicology. Others argue he was a doctor caught at a dangerous transitional moment in medicine, when old remedies overlapped with new regulations, and what was once common became criminal. Both readings may be true. Ellery himself seemed to believe he was neither murderer nor martyr, but something in between. "I did not kill," he wrote in one letter. "I administered medicine and the medicine decided." But that logic rings hollow to families who buried loved ones. To them, it wasn't the medicine. It was the hand that measured the dose. The poison cabinet as a symbol. The image of Ellery's locked cabinet rows of bottles marked with strange codes remains one of the most haunting details of the case. Even today, true crime historians cite it as a metaphor for hidden danger. Cabinets are meant to store cures. To open one and find death instead is to confront betrayal at its most intimate. Every community, in some sense, has a poison cabinet, a place where trust and danger coexist, unseen, until too late. Modern echoes. Ellery's case influenced more than just small-town folklore. In the 1950s and 1960s, partly in response to cases like his, Ohio introduced stricter regulations on toxic substances in medical practice. Doctors were required to log purchases of strychnine, arsenic, and digitalis in centralized state records. Nationally, the Ellery case was cited in early medical ethics courses as a cautionary tale about therapeutic ambiguity. The idea that the line between treatment and harm could not simply be left to one man's discretion. In this way, Ellery's crimes, whether born of malice, negligence, or arrogance, helped shift medicine toward greater oversight. A final reflection. Imagine yourself sitting in a small-town doctor's office. The wallpaper is faded, the chair creaks, the smell of antiseptic lingers faintly in the air. You trust this man with your pain, your life. He reaches into his cabinet, pours a clear liquid, hands it to you with steady hands. You drink. Do you swallow medicine or poison? For the people of Millstone, that question has no answer. And perhaps that is Ellery's final crime. Not just the deaths themselves, but the doubt he left behind. A doubt that outlived him, that outlived his cabinet, that still ticks quietly in the background of every trusting exchange between patient and doctor. Story 5. The Dockworker Who Stole the Sea. Ports are strange places. They are thresholds between worlds land and water, seen and unseen, legal and illicit. A ship arrives heavy with goods, and within hours the cargo vanishes inland, transformed into coin, contracts, and consumption. But what if some of it never makes that journey? What if the sea itself seems to swallow it? In the 1920s, in the bustling harbor of Newark, New Jersey, a quiet scandal unfolded. A single dockworker, or perhaps a small group, orchestrated one of the most unusual theft operations in American shipping history. Crates disappeared not from warehouses, not from trucks, but directly from the docks as if they had sunk back into the Atlantic before anyone could count them. The man at the center of it all became known in whispers as the dockworker who stole the sea. The golden age of the waterfront. To understand the crime, you must picture Newark Harbor in 1924. It was the height of prohibition. Cargo ships arrived daily with legal goods, grain, lumber, machine parts, and less legal shipments hidden below decks. Smuggling liquor was common, but so was theft. Dock workers were often underpaid, overworked, and left unsupervised for long stretches. The system ran on trust and paperwork. Cargo was tallied by clerks, checked against manifests, and moved inland by rail. A single missing crate could be blamed on miscounts, storms, or damage at sea. In this way, small thefts were invisible. But in 1924, something unusual caught the attention of shipping insurer Lloyd's of London. Entire containers, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds, were vanishing between ship and shore. Not misplaced, not delayed, gone. The first complaints. The earliest records come from an Italian shipping company, La Stella Marittima, which reported 3 missing crates of olive oil. At first, investigators assumed clerical error, but weeks later, a French cargo ship reported 2 missing crates of wine barrels. By summer, at least a dozen ships had filed insurance claims for cargo that had vanished on the docks of Newark. The claims puzzled everyone. Theft usually left traces: broken locks, damaged seals, footprints, witnesses. But these losses were described as evaporations. Goods present during unloading were gone minutes later, with no evidence of how. It was as if the sea itself had reclaimed them. The man called O'Hara. Dockside rumors pointed to a man named Patrick "Red" O'Hara. O'Hara was a longshoreman, a tall Irishman with broad shoulders and hands like grappling hooks. He had worked the docks since boyhood, carrying crates, swinging nets, and drinking hard in taverns by night. By all accounts, he was loyal, quiet, and unremarkable. Except for one thing. He always volunteered for the most difficult shifts: the night offloads, the stormy mornings, the jobs no one else wanted. And it was during those shifts that the evaporations occurred. Witnesses began to whisper that O'Hara had a method. Some claimed he used false paperwork. Others said he had a hidden tunnel beneath the dock. A few insisted he was in league with the sea itself, loading crates into boats that vanished into the dark tide. Whatever the truth, suspicion circled him, but no one dared confront him openly. The hidden barges. In 1925, a private detective named Albert Grayson, hired by Lloyd's, conducted a covert investigation. Disguised as a dockhand, he watched O'Hara for weeks. One night during a fog-heavy unload, Grayson noticed O'Hara guiding a crane unusually close to the water. Instead of swinging a crate onto the pier, O'Hara lowered it gently into the sea. Moments later, a flat, low-profile barge painted black slid silently from beneath the pier, taking the crate aboard. Within minutes, the barge vanished into the fog. Grayson had uncovered the secret. O'Hara wasn't stealing crates onto land. He was stealing them back into the sea. A system of disappearance. The brilliance of O'Hara's method was its simplicity. By diverting cargo directly into barges hidden under the pier, he bypassed every point of oversight. The crates never touched the dock. They were never tallied by clerks. By the time a discrepancy was noticed, the ship had sailed and the goods were already missing. The operation required timing, coordination, and a complete understanding of dock schedules. O'Hara, with years of experience, had both. But the biggest question remained: where did the stolen goods go? The black market flowed. Reports from Newark police hinted at a growing black market of luxury goods: olive oil, fine wines, fabrics, even machinery sold quietly through taverns and warehouses. The goods were often traced back to missing cargo from Newark Harbor. But O'Hara himself lived modestly. A small boarding room, cheap meals, no flashy spending. If he was profiting, he was hiding it well. Some suspected he was merely a middleman, feeding a larger syndicate. Grayson, in his reports, described O'Hara as a ghost in daylight seen by all, suspected by many, caught by none. The collapse of the investigation. By 1926, insurance companies and federal authorities had gathered enough suspicion to arrest O'Hara, but just as they prepared to act, he disappeared. One morning, he simply failed to show up for work. His room was empty, his few belongings gone. Some said he fled to Boston, others to Ireland. A few swore they saw him months later in Havana, working as a stevedore. But no arrest was ever made. And the missing cargo, it continued for another year, before vanishing as suddenly as O'Hara himself. An unresolved thought. Did Patrick O'Hara mastermind the theft alone? Or was he just the visible hand of a larger network that used the sea as its accomplice? And if he escaped, where did the stolen goods and the dockworker himself finally end up? The vanishing of Patrick read, O'Hara did not end the thefts at Newark Harbor, it made them worse. What began as isolated evaporations of cargo evolved into something larger, more organized, and far more dangerous. By the late 1920s, investigators realized O'Hara's ingenuity had not been a lone man's trick. It was the opening act of a criminal enterprise that blurred the line between dockside labor and organized crime. The Shadow Fleet. When O'Hara disappeared in 1926, Lloyd's investigator Albert Grayson thought the thefts would stop. Instead, entire shipments of luxury goods began to vanish: barrels of French wine, crates of Belgian linens, machinery from German manufacturers. Witnesses described the same strange sight: barges that seemed to emerge silently from the fog, load goods directly from cranes, and vanish downriver before sunrise. These vessels became known as the Shadow Fleet. Grayson returned to the docks, this time with federal backing. What he found was staggering. The operation had grown too large for one man. The Shadow Fleet was run by a syndicate, and O'Hara had either been absorbed into it or erased by it. The Dockworkers' Code. At Newark, dockworkers were bound by an unspoken code: never inform on your own. Wages were low, accidents frequent, and oversight minimal. Many men saw theft as a form of justice, a way to balance the books against companies that exploited them. But the syndicate changed things. Where O'Hara had seemed a phantom, the new operators were ruthless. Dockworkers who refused to cooperate found their shifts cut or their families threatened. The sea takes what it wants, they were told, as if theft were a natural force, not a crime. Fear grew on the docks. Everyone knew cargo was being stolen. No one spoke. The mob connection. By 1927, federal investigators discovered the thefts were connected to New York's waterfront mob, led by factions of the Italian-American mafia. Newark, though smaller than Manhattan's ports, was strategically valuable, less patrolled, less scrutinized, but close enough to funnel goods into New York's thriving black markets. Patrick O'Hara, it turned out, may have been their pioneer. His method, lowering crates directly into barges, was too ingenious to waste. Once the mob learned it, they expanded it, building entire crews around the scheme. The goods flowed steadily: wine into speakeasies, linens into underground shops, machine parts into backroom factories. The shadow fleet fed a shadow economy. The disappearance of Red O'Hara. What became of the man who invented it all? Rumors swirled. Some dockworkers whispered O'Hara had been paid handsomely to step aside, sent abroad to retire quietly. Others believed he had been killed by the syndicate, his body weighted and dropped into the same waters he once used for theft. One story, told decades later by a retired longshoreman, claimed O'Hara had been seen in Havana, working under another name, moving crates with the same practiced ease. Whether this was truth or tavern tale remains unknown. But the fact is, after 1926, O'Hara was never documented again. He became another ghost of the waterfront. The collapse of Grayson's case. Albert Grayson, the detective who first uncovered O'Hara's method, spent years trying to bring the syndicate down. He gathered affidavits, tracked shipments, even rode undercover on a barge. But in 1928, his case collapsed. Witnesses refused to testify. Records vanished. Clerks who had spoken suddenly recanted. It became clear the mob's influence reached far beyond the docks. In his final report to Lloyd's, Grayson wrote, "We are not dealing with theft, but with tide. It rises, it falls, and it cannot be arrested by one man with a pen." Defeated, he left the investigation. The thefts continued. The Great Vanishing of 1929. Then, in the spring of 1929, the largest single loss occurred. A shipment of 40 barrels of French cognac valued at $50,000 disappeared in a single night. The ship's captain swore he had watched the barrels unloaded. By morning, not one remained. When authorities traced the goods, they discovered the cognac flooding speakeasies across New York within days. The scale of the theft was undeniable. Newspapers called it the sea's appetite. But soon after, the stock market crash of October 1929 shifted national attention. The dock thefts faded from headlines. Amid financial chaos, missing cargo seemed almost trivial. After Prohibition. By the early 1930s, Prohibition ended, and so did much of the black market demand. The shadow fleet dwindled. Organized crime shifted focus to unions, gambling, and narcotics. The sea's appetite, it seemed, had been sated. But old dockworkers kept telling the story of Red O'Hara, the man who stole crates back into the water, who showed the mob a method so simple, it seemed like magic. A cliffhanger. Did O'Hara invent the thefts for himself, only to be swallowed by forces larger than he could control? Or was he always working for the syndicate, a pawn in a game that used the sea as both accomplice and grave? And if he survived, quietly moving crates in Havana or elsewhere, did he ever regret the tide he had unleashed? Every crime leaves ripples, some that fade quickly, others that stretch far beyond their moment. Patrick read, O'Hara's strange method of stealing crates into the sea may seem small compared to gangland murders or political scandals of his era, but the legacy it left behind reshaped how ports operated, how investigators thought, and how dockworkers told stories for generations. This final chapter explores how O'Hara's crime lived on through the sea, through myth, and through the very way we imagine the waterfront itself. The vanishing witnesses. By the 1930s, federal investigators attempted to reopen the Newark dock cases, but the trail was cold. The few dockworkers willing to speak had either disappeared, retired, or forgotten. One clerk who had originally filed complaints against O'Hara recanted under oath, saying, "The tide carries crates away, that's all I know." Another dock worker who had hinted at mob connections vanished on his way home one evening. His body was never found. Bit by bit, the case collapsed into silence. The syndicate had not only stolen goods, it had stolen memory. The Black Barge legend. Among longshoremen, the story of the Black Barge took on a life of its own. Men whispered that on foggy nights you could still hear the creak of ropes and the splash of water, even when no ship was in port. Some claimed the barge came for careless dockhands, pulling them under instead of crates. The rational truth was simpler. O'Hara and the mob had used barges as transport tools, but myths thrive where evidence fails. For generations of dockworkers, the Black Barge became a ghost ship, drifting eternally, carrying stolen goods into the horizon. Grayson's final pursuit. Albert Grayson, the private detective who had first uncovered O'Hara's trick, never fully let it go. In 1936, he published a memoir titled Fog Over Newark, detailing his undercover work on the docks. In it, he described O'Hara not as a villain but as a man who bent the sea to his will. Grayson admitted he admired O'Hara's ingenuity, even as he condemned the crimes. His book closed with a chilling reflection. Theft on land is one thing, theft into the sea is another. On land there are footprints, in the water there are none. The tide erases every trace. The memoir sold modestly, then disappeared into obscurity. But among crime historians, it remains one of the few first-hand accounts of the case. Ports changed forever. Though O'Hara himself was never caught, his thefts forced real change. By the 1930s, ports across America adopted new unloading protocols. Crates had to be tallied on ship manifests before leaving the hold. Dockside cranes were monitored by supervisors on rotation. Insurance inspectors were stationed at major harbors to verify goods on site. O'Hara's method, stealing goods before they touched land, exposed a blind spot in port oversight. The blind spot was closed, but only after millions of dollars had vanished into the tide. The Havana sightings. Despite his disappearance in 1926, O'Hara's name resurfaced now and again. In 1941, a U.S. naval officer reported seeing a dockworker in Havana with the same red hair and wide-shouldered frame as the photographs of O'Hara. The man spoke Spanish with an Irish lilt and disappeared before he could be questioned. Another sighting came in 1950, when a retired longshoreman claimed he'd drunk with O'Hara in a Havana tavern, where O'Hara supposedly laughed and said, "The sea gave me everything. Why would I go back to Newark?" No photographs, no proof, only words drifting like smoke. If he lived as he worked, unseen, slipping between the cracks of record and rumor. The long memory of the sea. By the 1960s, Newark's docks had modernized. Cranes were mechanized, paperwork digitized, and barges tracked. But still, old dockworkers told stories of O'Hara. To them, he was no longer a thief but a folk figure, half hero, half ghost. Some admired him for outsmarting the companies that exploited labor. Others cursed him for dragging the honest men of Newark into the shadow of mob corruption. Either way, his name lingered long after the crates had been drunk, worn, or sold. A crime without an ending. Historians remain divided. Did O'Hara truly mastermind the thefts, or was he a pawn of the syndicate from the start? Did he vanish by choice, by exile, or by death? We may never know. What we do know is that his method revealed something profound. Theft doesn't always need violence or even visibility. Sometimes the most powerful crime is the one that leaves no trace, where a crate is lowered into the sea, and by morning it is as if it never existed. A final reflection. Picture it, a foggy Newark night in 1925. The dock lamps glow weakly. A crane swings. A crate descends not onto the pier but into the tide. Below, a hidden barge slides silently away, its deck swallowing the cargo. By morning, the crate is gone, the dock is clean, and the sea keeps its secret. The dockworker who stole the sea did not just steal goods. He stole certainty itself. And certainty, once lost, is harder to recover than any crate. Story 6. The Librarian's Stolen Manuscripts. Libraries are built on trust. We trust that when we return a book, it will be placed back in its rightful spot. We trust that rare manuscripts are guarded for the future, not for private pockets. And above all, we trust the librarians, the quiet custodians of memory, who stand watch over centuries of knowledge. But what if the very keeper of the shelves was the thief? This is the story of Charles Langford, a respected librarian in the American Midwest during the 1970s, who orchestrated one of the most meticulous and damaging manuscript thefts in modern history. For nearly a decade, priceless works disappeared from archives under his care, leaving institutions baffled and scholars enraged. The University Library in Bloomington. Our story begins at Indiana University, Bloomington, home to a special collections library that housed early American letters, Civil War documents, and rare European manuscripts dating back centuries. In 1972, the library hired Charles Langford, a quiet, bespectacled man in his early 40s with a PhD in history. Langford was known for his encyclopedic memory, his ability to recite catalog numbers from heart, and his tireless work ethic. Colleagues described him as the kind of man you forgot was in the room until you needed him. But Langford had a hidden obsession, not just studying manuscripts but owning them. The first disappearance. In 1973, a researcher requested a letter written by Abraham Lincoln in 1859. The catalog confirmed its presence, but the document could not be found. Staff searched for weeks, assuming it had been misfiled. Months later, another researcher requested a rare 17th century medical treatise, again missing. At first, these were written off as clerical errors. Libraries lose track of items, records lag behind reality, but the pattern grew undeniable. By 1975, over 24 rare manuscripts had quietly vanished from the Bloomington archives. Still, suspicion did not yet fall on Langford. He was, after all, the librarian helping to search. The method of disappearance. Langford's genius was not just in stealing manuscripts, but in how he erased their absence. Whenever he removed an item, he would alter or update the catalog entry. Sometimes he marked it as on loan, sometimes as sent for restoration, and sometimes he quietly shifted its classification code so researchers never requested it at all. The missing works didn't appear stolen. They appeared to have never been there. This sleight of hand made the thefts nearly invisible for years. Scholars assumed errors, administrators assumed clerical confusion, and Langford, calm and meticulous, kept his pockets lined with parchment and ink. The black market for manuscripts. Why steal manuscripts? Unlike jewelry or cash, they cannot be flaunted. They are unique, traceable, often useless outside scholarly circles. But in the 1970s, a lucrative black market for rare manuscripts thrived. Wealthy private collectors in the US and Europe were willing to pay exorbitant sums for historic letters, first drafts, and obscure volumes. The rarer the piece, the higher the price. For collectors who valued secrecy, provenance mattered less than possession. If a Lincoln letter appeared on their desk, they did not ask how it left Bloomington. Langford tapped into this world quietly, selling pieces through intermediaries, antiquarian dealers in Chicago, New York, and London. The suspicion grows. By 1977, the scale of the losses could no longer be ignored. Internal audits revealed that at least 148 manuscripts were unaccounted for. Some were relatively minor, but others were invaluable. Revolutionary War letters, original poetry drafts, rare theological tracts. The administration formed a discreet task force to investigate. Security was tightened. Staff were quietly monitored. Langford, once trusted without question, now felt the net drawing closer. Yet he showed no fear. He kept to his routines, cataloging with precision, assisting researchers with quiet patience. But beneath his calm, he began making mistakes. The misfiled letter. The turning point came in 1978 when a graduate student stumbled upon a box mislabeled in storage. Inside was a collection of 19th century sermons. At the bottom of the box lay a loose envelope, half hidden. Inside was a letter from Walt Whitman, one long presumed missing. The discovery proved two things. The manuscripts had not all vanished. Some had been hidden within the library itself, and whoever had hidden them was someone with deep knowledge of the system. All eyes turned at last to Charles Langford, the librarian's double life. Investigators soon uncovered a trail. Langford's modest salary did not explain his private collection of antique furniture, his trips to Europe, or his quiet dealings with rare book dealers. One dealer, when pressed, admitted to buying manuscripts from Langford under the table. Others denied it, but their denials rang hollow. The librarian, who had once seemed invisible, was suddenly very visible indeed. An unresolved thought. Why would a man entrusted with preserving history choose instead to plunder it? Was Langford driven by greed, or by a deeper obsession with holding history in his own hands, beyond the reach of scholars and students? And if so, how many of the missing manuscripts were still in private hands, and how many had been lost forever? When the first whispers of theft turned into undeniable evidence, the case of Charles Langford shifted from quiet suspicion to a full-scale investigation. What began with missing Lincoln and Whitman letters now unraveled into something far greater, a systematic looting of history by the very man hired to guard it. This section follows the tightening noose around Langford, the mistakes that exposed him, and the devastating realization of just how much had been stolen from the shelves of Bloomington. The silent audit. In 1978, Indiana University authorized a silent audit of its special collections. Teams of archivists worked after hours, combing through catalog records, physical holdings, and acquisition files. They moved like ghosts through the library stacks, instructed not to alert staff that an investigation was underway. The results shocked even the most skeptical administrators. Over 300 manuscripts, letters, and rare volumes were missing. Some losses were small, a colonial-era pamphlet, a faded ledger. Others were irreplaceable Civil War generals' letters, early drafts of American poets, European treatises from the 1500s. The library had not suffered clerical error. It had been gutted. And the man with access to every record, every locked drawer, every key, Charles Langford. The dealer slip. Investigators had difficulty proving Langford's direct role until one antiquarian dealer in Chicago slipped. During an unrelated tax audit, authorities found purchase receipts for letters signed by Ulysses S. Grant. When asked about the seller, the dealer hesitated, then admitted he had acquired them from a university librarian in Indiana. He produced a name reluctantly, Charles Langford. With this admission, investigators had their first link between missing manuscripts and Langford's personal dealings. The pattern of disguise. Langford's methods grew clearer as more evidence emerged. He employed three strategies: internal mislabeling, hiding documents in misfiled boxes, disguised under incorrect subject headings; phantom loans, recording manuscripts as on loan to scholars who never existed; selective dispersal, selling high-value items discreetly while hiding lower-value ones inside the library to delay detection. It was an archivist's crime, subtle, patient, designed to blend theft into the chaos of cataloging. But Langford's greatest strength, his knowledge of the system, was also his undoing. His handwriting appeared in suspicious, loan notes. His corrections to catalog cards often coincided with missing items. The ink betrayed him. A colleague's doubt. One librarian, Margaret Holloway, recalled an incident that later haunted her. In 1976, she asked Langford for help locating a rare Revolutionary War diary. He told her calmly that the item was sent to preservation. Months later, she learned no such transfer had occurred. "I should have pressed harder," Holloway said years later. "But you don't suspect the man who knows the system better than anyone. That was his genius. He didn't just steal manuscripts, he stole our ability to question him." The sting operation. By 1979, investigators decided they needed direct evidence. They arranged a sting with the cooperation of a New York antiquarian dealer. The dealer contacted Langford, expressing interest in acquiring Civil War letters not yet in circulation. Langford, cautious, agreed to meet. Hidden microphones recorded the exchange as Langford produced 3 letters signed by General William Tecumseh Sherman, all missing from the Bloomington archive. It was enough. Federal agents arrested him days later. The arrest. Langford's arrest stunned his colleagues. He was taken quietly from his office, escorted past the shelves he had once cataloged so meticulously. Some librarians wept, others stood in cold silence. When agents searched his home, they found dozens of manuscripts stacked in drawers and closets. Many were valuable, but some were obscure items of little monetary worth. Investigators concluded Langford was not only profiting, but also hoarding. He seemed unable to let history go even if it meant stealing it. The scope of the theft. At trial, the numbers became clear. Over 400 items stolen or misplaced. At least 150 sold into private collections in the US and Europe. Many more hidden in his home, recovered intact. The losses were staggering, not just in monetary terms valued at several $1,000,000, but in cultural cost. Manuscripts meant for students, scholars, and the public had been lost into private vaults. The courtroom defense. Langford's defense rested on 2 claims. He had not stolen manuscripts, but temporarily removed them for personal study. The black market sales were the work of unscrupulous dealers, not him. The jury didn't believe him. Handwriting analysis, receipts, and eyewitness accounts tied him directly to the thefts. In 1980, Charles Langford was convicted of interstate transportation of stolen property and wire fraud. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The manuscripts that never returned. While some items were recovered, many were not. Letters, drafts, diaries gone into private hands. Collectors, fearful of prosecution, refused to return them. Some likely remain locked in vaults today, silent victims of Langford's obsession. One scholar lamented, "A book misplaced is an inconvenience. A book stolen is a wound. Langford wounded history." A cliffhanger. But even after prison, even after conviction, one question lingered. Why did Langford take items of no monetary value? Why hoard obscure diaries alongside Lincoln letters? Was it greed alone, or was it something stranger, an obsession with possessing history itself? When Charles Langford entered federal prison in 1980, the scholarly world exhaled in relief. The man who had looted history was behind bars. Yet for those who studied his crimes, relief was fleeting. The manuscripts he sold or hid were scattered across the globe. Some were recovered, others vanished into private collections, never to be seen again. Langford himself remained an enigma. Was he a thief motivated by greed, or a man consumed by an obsession to hold history in his own hands? This section follows his years in prison, the fragments of manuscripts that resurfaced, and the unsettling reflection his case left behind for archivists everywhere. A prison scholar. Langford entered prison with the demeanor of a man moving from one library to another. He requested access to the prison's modest law library, where he read obsessively. Fellow inmates described him as quiet, polite, and unreachable. He refused to discuss the manuscripts. Instead, he lectured anyone who would listen about the fragility of archives, how history was always one careless fire away from vanishing. To prison administrators, he was well behaved. To scholars, he was a pariah. His name became a curse in academic circles, shorthand for betrayal. The letters that resurfaced. During his sentence, investigators tracked down several of the manuscripts he had sold. Some collectors, facing pressure, returned them anonymously. Others demanded compensation. A few insisted the documents had been bought in good faith and refused to part with them. Among the recovered items were the Lincoln Letter of 1859, rediscovered in a London collection; several Civil War diaries, hidden for years in a private New York estate; the Whitman Letter, which had been misfiled, now restored to the archive. But more than half of the stolen items never returned. Each missing manuscript was a reminder of Langford's long reach. The parole hearing. In 1987, after serving 7 years, Langford appeared before a parole board. He spoke calmly, articulately, and without remorse. "I regret the confusion my actions caused," he said, "but I believe history belongs to all of us, not locked in basements where no one reads it." The board granted him parole. He was 55 years old. Life after prison. After release, Langford lived quietly in Illinois. He never worked in a library again. Instead, he supported himself with part-time teaching and freelance editing. Neighbors knew him as the quiet professor, unaware of his past. Yet rumors persisted. Antiquarian dealers whispered that Langford still possessed manuscripts never recovered. No evidence surfaced, but the suspicion clung to him until his death in 2003. The scholar's verdict. For archivists and historians, Langford's case became a cautionary tale. His betrayal forced institutions across the United States to tighten security. Double entry catalogs replaced single record systems. Restricted access policies limited who could handle rare manuscripts. Libraries began microfilming fragile documents to preserve their contents. Langford's thefts, paradoxically, strengthened the very system he undermined. His crimes reshaped the culture of archives for decades. The psychology of obsession. Why did he do it? Scholars and criminologists debated this for years. Some saw him as a simple thief, driven by greed, but others pointed to the worthless items he stole: obscure diaries, letters of minor clergymen, treatises unread for centuries. These had no market value, yet Langford hoarded them with the same intensity as Lincoln's signature. Perhaps it was not money, but possession. The thrill of holding history privately, of knowing that knowledge belonged not to the public but to him alone. One criminologist described him as a bibliomaniac, not a collector in the usual sense, but a man compelled to seize what he could not morally claim. A legacy of distrust. Today, librarians still speak of the Langford effect. His case is taught in library science courses as an example of internal threat, when the danger is not outsiders breaking in, but insiders betraying trust. It is a chilling reminder that guardianship itself can be corrupted. A final reflection. Imagine walking into a library, the smell of paper heavy in the air, the hush of shelves pressing around you. You pull a catalog card expecting to find a letter, a diary, a poem. But the shelf is empty. The record is false. The history is gone. For decades, readers in Bloomington experienced that silence. A silence left not by fire, not by war, but by a single librarian who decided history belonged to him. And so the greatest theft was not of manuscripts, but of trust, the trust that libraries and those who guard them will always keep the past safe for the future.